Ravenhook Divide had vanished. Snow did not fall there that night. It flew flat across the world, driving so hard through the black timber that every spruce on the ridge seemed to be screaming. The cold had dropped to 31 below zero. At that temperature, a man caught in open wind did not have a long night ahead of him. He had less than an hour. But under a broken shelf of basalt, a freight hauler named Rowan was still alive. He lay inside a hollow so narrow his knees could not straighten, and his coat scraped stone whenever he breathed too deeply. The opening in front of him had been blocked by the torn sidewall of his own freight wagon. Around it, he had packed frozen clay, spruce needles, strips of flour sack, shattered plank, and handfuls of dry root moss until the seam no longer looked like an entrance. Outside, the blizzard hammered at the mountain. A few feet away, in a crooked pocket behind a black boulder, his mule Bramble stood with frost in its mane, breathing hard through the storm's vibration. Inside the low stone hollow, a cracked lantern sat on an overturned medicine crate. Rowan watched the flame. The wind struck so violently that loose ice rattled over the rock roof like thrown nails. The wagon wall trembled. Snow hissed against the packed clay. Somewhere above him, a spruce limb snapped and disappeared into the dark. But the flame did not lean. It rose straight from the wick, thin and yellow, as if the storm outside belonged to another world. That was the proof Rowan needed. The cold could wait outside. The wind had not found the room. And to understand why one ruined wagon became the one place on Ravenhook Divide where a man could survive, you have to go back to the paper Rowan carried in his coat. 2 days earlier, Ravenhook looked harmless. Morning light sat soft on the valley below the divide. The fields were already brown from frost. Smoke rose cleanly from the chimney of Rowan's cabin. His wife, Eliza, stood near the stove with flour on her sleeves, and their daughter Willa knelt on a chair beside the table, cutting a strip from an old red scarf. The cabin was small. The barn leaned slightly east. The well rope had been spliced twice. The fence behind the garden had more patches than rails. It was not much property. But it was theirs. That morning, Gideon Pike rode out from town and left a folded notice on the table. He did not shout. Men like Gideon rarely needed to. He owned the store, the grain ledger, half the equipment contracts in the valley, and 3 notes against families who had taken seed on credit after the summer drought. Rowan's note was nearly due. One final payment would clear it. Miss that payment, and Gideon could claim the land before Christmas. After Pike left, the notice stayed on the table between Rowan and Eliza. Neither of them touched it for a long time. Then Rowan folded it, placed it inside his coat, and walked to the barn. By noon, he had taken a freight job nobody else wanted. The mining camp at Alderspur needed medicine, lamp oil, flour, and a replacement gear for the stamp mill. The route crossed Ravenhook Divide before dropping toward the North Gulch. In clear weather, it was a hard pull. In late November, it was the kind of road that made old teamsters suddenly remember work that needed doing at home. The pay was enough. That was the trap. Eliza came out as Rowan checked the wagon. The box was old, iron-banded, and scarred from years of mountain freight. One rear wheel had 2 new spokes and 1 old crack. The brake chain had been shortened after a break the previous spring. The canvas cover had been mended so many times it looked less like canvas than a map of every storm it had survived. Willa stood near the barn door, holding the red strip from the scarf. "For the brake lever," she said. Rowan looked at it, then at the lever wrapped in old rawhide. That lever already has a binding. This is better. It was not better. It was a child's strip of wool. Rowan took it anyway and tied it around the lower part of the handle. Eliza watched him test the wheel hub. Ravenhook is already white at the top, she said. I know. You could wait 2 days. The camp won't pay me for arriving after the mill stops. She glanced toward the folded paper inside his coat. She did not have to mention it. Rowan tightened the last strap over the freight. Then he rested one hand on Bramble's neck. The mule was broad, patient, and old enough to understand more about mountain roads than most men who spoke loudly in town. I'll cross before the next hard blow, Rowan said. Eliza did not answer quickly. At last, she stepped closer and pulled his collar up against his neck. Then cross smart, she said, not proud. The freight yard below town was colder than the valley. Ned Barrow was standing there when Rowan arrived. Ned had hauled ore and timber through Ravenhook before Rowan was old enough to lift a harness. He walked once around the wagon and said nothing at first. That was worse than a warning. He looked at the patched canvas. He looked at the rear wheel. He looked at the single mule. Then he looked toward the divide. That grade doesn't forgive a short team, Ned said. It's not a full load. It's enough to kill the brake. Rowan checked the lashings again. The brake held last spring. Ned touched the shortened chain with 2 fingers. Last spring was mud. This is ice. From the warehouse porch, Gideon Pike listened with his hands in his coat pockets. A man can lose a farm while he waits for perfect roads, Pike said. Ned's face hardened, but he did not speak to Gideon. He kept his eyes on Rowan. You get caught above the timber bend, Ned said. Don't try to walk out. Men die walking in circles up there. Rowan took the manifest from the clerk and signed it. The pen scratched once. That was all it took to turn a bad idea into a contract. Before noon, the valley road was behind him. The first miles were ugly but familiar. Bramble leaned into the traces. The wagon groaned through frozen ruts. Snow lay thin in the low places, and deeper where the road entered shadow. By mid-afternoon, the trees changed. The lower pines gave way to black spruce and wind-bent fir. Rock faces appeared through the timber. The road narrowed to a shelf cut into the side of the mountain, with a ravine below and a granite shoulder above. Rowan kept one hand near the brake. He watched the weather more than the road. Clouds had been gathering all day, but near the upper bend something worse arrived. Stillness. The wind simply stopped. Bramble's ears went forward. Snow dust that had been sliding across the road settled flat. The branches above them froze in place. Even the little sounds of the harness seemed too loud. Rowan felt the hair beneath his collar rise. There were quiet moments in the mountains that meant peace. This was not one of them. The air felt pressed down, thick and waiting, as if the whole divide had drawn a breath and refused to let it out. Ned Barrow's old warning came back to him. When the mountain goes silent, start counting. Rowan climbed onto the wagon step and looked north. Over the ridge, a wall of cloud had begun to move in. It was not gray. It was the color of lead scraped raw, with a bruised purple edge where the light died inside it. He had maybe 2 hours before the road disappeared, maybe less. He snapped the reins. Bramble pulled harder. The wagon entered the exposed shelf road just as the first needles of ice began ticking against the canvas. Rowan did the math without wanting to. Behind him was too far. Ahead was the timber bend, and then the long descent toward Alder Spur. Between those 2 points lay the most dangerous mile of Ravenhook Divide, where the road crossed a stone lip above a ravine and no trees stood close enough to break the wind. He urged Bramble forward. The road turned glassy. The wheels slid more than they rolled. At the worst part of the shelf, the left rear wheel struck a buried stone under the snow. The wagon lurched downhill. Rowan drove his boot against the brake lever. For 1 second it held. Then the shortened brake chain snapped. The sound was small, almost delicate. It was the sound of the whole day ending. The wagon slewed sideways. The load shifted with a heavy wooden boom. Bramble lunged, felt the weight come crooked behind him, and panicked. The tongue twisted against the harness. One wheel lifted. The wagon slammed against the uphill bank, bounced back, and dropped hard onto its cracked rear wheel. The wheel exploded. Spokes ripped free. The iron tire spun into the snow. The wagon box dropped at an angle and pinned itself between the road bank and a slab of rock. Rowan was thrown shoulder first into the sideboard. For a moment, the world became white sound. Then Bramble screamed. Rowan moved before his thoughts returned. He stumbled down from the box, slipped on the iced road, and half fell beneath the mule's neck. Bramble thrashed against the twisted harness, eyes rolling, breath blasting white. "Easy," Rowan said, though nothing was easy now. "Easy, I'm here." His hands shook so badly the first buckle would not open. He forced them still. One strap, then another, then the belly band. He cut the last knot with his knife and pulled the tongue free before the mule broke a leg trying to escape it. Bramble backed away, trembling. Rowan stood with the broken brake chain in his hand and looked at the wagon. The rear wheel was gone. The box was wedged sideways. The road above and below was already whitening over. The storm wall had swallowed the north ridge. A repair was impossible. Walking out was worse. The divide had closed. For several seconds, Rowan's mind tried to argue with reality. He thought of the payment. He thought of the medicine crates. He thought of the mill gear. He thought of the land. Then the first real gust struck the shelf road and cut through his coat as if the wool were paper. All of those thoughts became smaller. One question remained. Where could the wind not reach? Rowan climbed the road bank and scanned the slope. There was no cabin, no line shack, no miner's hut, nothing but rock, scrub spruce, deadfall, and snow beginning to move sideways. Then he saw a dark shape below the road, not a cave, a break in the mountain. About 60 yards downslope, an old basalt shelf jutted from the hillside where a landslide had torn the earth away years before. Beneath the shelf was a shallow hollow filled with black shadow. Snow had collected everywhere around it, but inside the hollow, the ground looked almost bare. Rowan stared. That bare ground mattered. Snow was flying across the slope, yet it had not settled under the rock lip. The wind was skipping over the hollow instead of drilling through it. He slid down the bank toward it, nearly falling twice. When he reached the shelf, he dropped to his knees and crawled inside. The space was miserable, barely 3 feet high near the front, lower toward the back. The stone roof pressed down hard enough that a tall man would hate every minute inside it. A basalt wall closed the rear. A boulder sealed the right side. The left side curved into a shallow pocket where roots and stone made a crooked stall. It had protection on 3 sides. The front was open. Rowan crouched there as a gust came over the slope and curled straight into the hollow. It struck him under the ribs, sharp and absolute. He understood immediately. The shelf was not a shelter. Not yet. Without a front wall, it would become a mouth. The wind would pour inside, bounce off the rear stone, and tear every bit of heat out of him until he stopped shivering. He backed out and looked up toward the ruined wagon. The left side of the wagon box faced him. 6 boards, iron-banded, scarred by years of freight. It had been built to hold cargo through mountain roads. Now it could hold back wind. The problem was simple. It was attached to a wreck, and it weighed more than any tired man should try to move. Rowan stood in the rising storm, looking between the hollow and the wagon, and heard his father's voice from long ago. A wall is not what keeps you warm. Still air keeps you warm. A wall only earns its name if the air behind it stops moving. That was the answer. He did not need comfort. He needed stillness. Rowan climbed back to the wreck and took the pry bar from the tool roll. The wagon could not be saved. Pretending otherwise would kill him. He drove the bar under the first iron brace and threw his weight against it. The brace groaned but did not move. He struck it with the hammer. Once, twice, again. The metal bent. A bolt tore loose. The storm advanced while he worked. Ice stung his face. His gloves stiffened. Twice he lost the hammer in the snow and found it only by sweeping with both hands. He stopped thinking in minutes. He thought in bolts. 1 bolt left, 1 board loose, 1 breath more. The sidewall finally ripped free with a splintering crack and dropped against his thigh. Pain shot through his leg, but he kept hold of it. If it slid over the ravine edge, the storm would have won before it arrived. Rowan tied rope through the iron bands and wrapped the end around his shoulder. He pulled. The wall did not move. He changed angle and pulled again. It scraped 1/2 inch. That 1/2 inch became the first victory of the night. He dragged the wagon wall down from the road 1 brutal foot at a time. It caught on stone. It buried its lower edge in snow. It spun sideways and nearly knocked him down. He pried it loose, pulled, slipped, cursed once, and pulled again. Bramble helped only for the longest stretch. Rowan looped the rope low across the mule's collar and guided him carefully until the wall slid past the worst rock. Then he freed the animal at once. A frightened mule could break a shelter faster than any storm. The last yards had to be done by hand. By the time Rowan reached the basalt shelf, his shirt was wet beneath his coat and freezing against his back. His lungs burned. The world had darkened to a blue-gray blur. There was no time to rest. He levered the wagon wall upright across the open front of the hollow. It was too wide by a few inches on one side and too short at the top on the other. That was better than too small. He jammed one end behind the boulder. He wedged the other against a notch in the basalt. Then he hammered a broken wheel spoke into the ground as a stake and lashed the iron bands to it with rope. The hollow had a front now. But a wall full of gaps was only a slower way to freeze. Rowan pulled the patched wagon canvas from the wreck. He cut it free in ragged pieces and stretched the largest section over the gap above the sidewall. He used flour sacks to block the lower cracks where the boards no longer met the ground. Spruce boughs went outside first, angled like fingers to catch drifting snow. Dry needles and root moss went inside the cracks. Then came clay. The ground under the shelf was frozen at the surface, but beneath the overhang, Rowan found pockets of damp earth that had not turned to stone. He chopped it loose with the hatchet and packed it into seams with the heel of his hand. Clay over cloth. Needles behind clay, snow outside branches. Each layer had one purpose: make the wind spend itself before it reached the air he needed to breathe. At the top left corner, the canvas kept flapping loose. Rowan reached for rope and found none short enough. Then he saw the red wool strip tied around the broken brake lever. For a moment his hand stopped. Willa had tied it there that morning, serious as a preacher. Rowan cut it free, threaded it through a split in the canvas, and tied the loose corner to the iron band of the wagon wall. The red wool disappeared almost completely under snow, but the corner stopped moving. He left one vent the width of 2 fingers near the sheltered side, turned away from the storm. Everything else he sealed as if his life were trying to leak through it, because it was. When the first version of the shelter was finished, Rowan crawled inside and pulled the flap tight behind him. The darkness had weight. He set a small lantern on a medicine crate and struck a match. The wick caught. A thin yellow flame rose in the cracked chimney. For 3 breaths it stood straight. Then it leaned. Not much, just enough. Rowan stared at it. The flame bent toward the back wall, then straightened, then bent again. A leak. Somewhere low, the wind had found a path under the wagon wall. He slid his bare wrist near the floor and waited. The cold touched him like a knife drawn slowly across skin. There, under the left board, behind the flour sack. Rowan killed the lantern and crawled back out into the storm. The next repair hurt worse because his body had already begun asking him to stop. He packed clay until his fingers went numb. He shoved moss into the low crack with the tip of his knife. He dragged 2 flat stones against the outside seam and buried spruce boughs around them so the storm would pile snow where he wanted it. The wind was no longer coming in gusts. It had become a single force. When he crawled back inside, he lit the lantern again. The flame rose. The shelter shook. The flame stayed straight. Rowan felt no triumph, only a cold, clear fear of how close he had come to sleeping inside a trap. A shelter that leaked near the ground did not warn a tired man loudly. It killed him politely. There was still Bramble. The mule stood half-turned from the wind, head low, ice forming along its bridle hair. Rowan could not bring the animal into the hollow. The stone roof was too low. But the crooked pocket beside the right boulder gave just enough space for Bramble to stand, with the worst wind passing over him. Rowan led him there carefully. He stretched a remaining strip of canvas from the boulder to a root tangle and braced it with broken wagon boughs. He stacked boughs along the windward side. It was not a stall. It was not warm, but it broke the straight line of the gale. That could mean the difference between a living mule and a frozen shape by morning. Only after Bramble was sheltered did Rowan return to the freight. He made decisions quickly. Medicine crates inside, lamp oil inside, flour sacks inside, because flour could freeze, but wet flour would be useless. The small tool roll inside, the ledger packet inside his coat. The stamp mill gear stayed under the ruined wagon box. It was too heavy to move before dark. He wrapped it in canvas, dragged broken boards over it, and built a snow berm around the base. Then the blizzard arrived fully. There was no gradual beginning. The world simply disappeared. Snow smashed across Ravenhook Divide in a solid sheet. The wind hit the basalt shelf with a deep, rushing roar, climbed over it, and crashed down beyond the hollow. Loose ice blasted the wagon wall. The canvas snapped once, twice, then hardened as freezing spray locked it against the boards. Inside, Rowan lay on his side with his shoulder against stone and his boots pressed near the medicine crate. He had no room to sit properly, no room to stretch, no room to forget where he was. That smallness saved him. A large space would have swallowed his body heat. This cramped pocket held it close. He put out the lantern after one final look at the flame. Straight, darkness took the hollow. For the first hour, Rowan survived by listening. Every sound had meaning. A whistle meant moving air. A slap meant loose canvas. A heavy thump meant snowpacking against the outer branches. Once, the wagon wall gave a low creak and pressed inward. Rowan reached out and felt the board flex beneath his palm. The storm had found the wall. Now it was trying to teach the wall how to fail. Rowan pushed a medicine crate against the lower boards and wedged the broken brake lever between the crate and the stone roof. The red wool strip still held the canvas above it, stiff with ice. Outside, Bramble stamped once, then again. Rowan spoke into the dark, not loudly, because sound felt wasteful in that space. "Stand easy, old boy." The mule's breathing came rough through the side pocket. Then the storm changed angle. A hard blast struck from below the shelf, and the lantern chimney, though unlit, clicked softly against the crate. Rowan lit it again with shaking fingers. The flame leaned. For one terrible second, it leaned hard. Rowan's stomach dropped. The lower brace had shifted. He did not think. Thinking would have told him to stay inside. He crawled out under the flap and entered the white violence. The wind took his breath immediately. He moved by touch, one hand on the wagon wall, one knee in the snow. The outside branch layer had collapsed near the left corner. Snow had piled wrong, creating a channel instead of a block. He tore boughs from the drift and shoved them into the channel. He threw his body against the wall to hold the canvas while he jammed the last broken board across the gap. His gloves were useless now, soaked and freezing. His fingers felt thick and stupid. A gust drove him sideways. For a moment, he lost the wall. There was only white. Then his hand struck the iron band. He clung to it, dragged himself back to the opening, and packed snow against the repaired corner with both forearms until the storm itself began pressing the patch into place. By the time he crawled back inside, his teeth were chattering so hard his jaw hurt. He lit the lantern. The flame rose straight. Rowan held the sight with his eyes until his breathing slowed. That was the whole night. Not hope, not courage. A flame standing upright. After that, time became smaller. He tucked his hands under his armpits. He pulled one flour sack beneath his hip to keep his body off the stone. He took one mouthful of water from the canteen inside his coat and felt grateful that it was still liquid. The hollow did not grow warm. That was never the miracle. The miracle was that the cold stopped moving. Outside the shelter, wind stole heat faster than flesh could make it. Inside, the air became still enough for his own body and the muffled warmth from Bramble's pocket to matter. Moisture from his breath gathered on the rock and froze in tiny beads. The lantern chimney frosted on one side. The medicine crate beneath it stayed dry. The storm kept working, but so did the shelter. Snow caught in the spruce boughs and locked against the wagon wall. Clay hardened, flour sacks stiffened, canvas froze into a single curved skin. Every hour that should have weakened the shelter made parts of it stronger. Sometime deep in the night, Rowan pulled the folded notice from his coat. It was dry. He could not see the writing, but his fingers knew the shape of the paper. He thought of Eliza standing in the doorway, telling him to cross smart, not proud. He thought of Willa's red strip of wool, holding a corner of canvas against a mountain storm. Then he thought of Gideon Pike, warm in his store, believing deadlines were stronger than weather. Rowan folded the paper again and put it away. The storm could have the wagon. It could have the road. It could have the comfort of any plan he had made. It could not have the land unless it got through that wall first. Near dawn, the roar thinned. Not stopped, thinned. The blizzard's voice moved higher up the divide, dragging itself across the ridge like a tired animal. Inside the hollow, Rowan woke without remembering falling asleep. Gray light seeped through ice-stiff canvas. For a while, he did not move. He listened. No whistle, no slap. No rushing leak near the floor. Only Bramble breathing outside the boulder pocket, slow and alive. Rowan laughed once. It came out like a cough. He chipped at the entrance with the hatchet handle. Snow had sealed the flap from outside. He broke it loose in plates, then crawled into morning. Ravenhook Divide was unrecognizable. The road had vanished under smooth white drifts. The ravine had become a pale, dangerous bowl. The ruined wagon sat half-buried above him, its remaining frame twisted against the bank. The storm had built a chest-high wall of snow around the basalt shelf. That snow wall was why he was standing. Rowan looked at the shelter from the outside. It was ugly. A torn wagon side jammed into black rock, canvas frozen crooked, flour sacks visible in the seams, spruce boughs crushed under snow, one red strip of wool stiff with ice. No one passing in fair weather would have called it clever. In that storm, it had been the difference between a corpse and a man. Bramble lifted his head from the side pocket. Frost covered his mane and lashes, but his eyes were clear. Rowan pressed his forehead briefly against the mule's neck. "Still here," he whispered. The day was not finished. The freight still had to move. Rowan spent the morning breaking what remained of the wagon into something the mountain would allow. 2 long side rails became runners. Cross pieces from the box became a drag frame. Canvas formed a bed. Rope and harness straps held the whole crooked thing together. It was not a wagon. It was not even a proper sled, but it moved over snow. The medicine crates went first, then lamp oil, then the flour. Rowan nearly abandoned the mill gear. He stood over it for a long time, knowing what it represented. Without it, the camp might cut payment. Without payment, the receipt in his mind became smoke. He built a ramp of packed snow and plank, rolled the gear one painful quarter turn at a time, and levered it onto the drag frame. Bramble leaned forward. The sled creaked. The gear moved. They reached Alder Spur near dusk, a full day late. Men came out of the supply shed and stopped in the snow. They had heard the storm all night. Everyone in camp had. By morning, most had decided the freight was buried somewhere on Ravenhook, or gone over the ravine entirely. Now Rowan Hale walked into camp behind a frost-burned mule, dragging half a wagon with the freight lashed on top. The quartermaster, Simon Vale, stepped down from the porch. His eyes moved from the sled to Rowan's split hands, then to the empty place where a wagon should have been. He did not ask at first. He opened the manifest. Medicine crates intact, lamp oil intact, flour damaged but usable, stamp mill gear present, with one scraped edge and nothing more. Simon signed the receipt slowly. Then he counted out the money. The leather pouch felt heavier than any load Rowan had dragged over the mountain. Simon finally looked past him toward the divide. What happened up there? Rowan tucked the signed receipt inside his coat. Ravenhook wanted a wall, he said. I gave it one. The way home took longer. Snow erased road edges. Frozen ruts hid under drifts. Rowan walked more than he rode because Bramble had already given too much. By the time they dropped below the timber and entered the valley road, stories had traveled ahead of them. Some said the wagon had gone over the ravine. Some said Rowan had turned back and frozen near the upper bend. Some said no man could have crossed Ravenhook after the storm closed. At the cabin, Eliza had kept the stove burning through the second night. Willa had stopped asking when he would return. She watched the road instead. Late in the afternoon, she saw the mule first. Bramble came slowly through the gray light, head low, harness hanging unevenly. Behind him walked a man in a torn coat, one hand on the lead rope, the other pressed against his chest as if holding something in place. Willa ran before Eliza reached the door. She slipped in the snow, got up, and ran harder. Rowan dropped to one knee when she reached him. She hid him with both arms around his neck and held on so tightly he closed his eyes. Eliza stopped a few steps away. For a moment, she looked at the cut above his eyebrow, the swollen knuckles, the frost cracks along his cheeks. Then she saw him breathing. That was enough. She crossed the last steps and put both hands on his face. Neither of them spoke. The next morning, Rowan walked into Gideon Pike's store. Ned Barrow was there, near the stove, warming his hands around a cup of coffee. 2 other men stood by the counter. Gideon looked up from his ledger as Rowan entered. No one spoke until Rowan placed the money on the counter. Then he placed the signed receipt beside it. Gideon counted slowly. He counted twice. The numbers did not change. The note was cleared. Ned Barrow looked at Rowan's torn coat, then at the money, then at the frost-burned hands. "Where's your wagon?" Ned asked. Rowan folded the receipt and slid it into his coat. "Still on Ravenhook." Ned waited. Rowan looked toward the mountain through the store window, holding the door. 3 days later, Ned rode up to the divide with 2 men from town. They found the shelter under the basalt shelf exactly where Rowan had left it. The storm had preserved it like evidence. The wagon side still stood across the opening. Clay had frozen hard around the lower seams. Spruce boughs were buried inside the drift. Flour sack cloth showed at the edges where it had been packed into cracks. A broken brake lever braced the wall from within. Near the upper corner, a strip of red wool held a torn piece of canvas to an iron band. Ned stood in front of it for a long time. He had seen men trust stronger wagons and die. He had seen men build bigger fires and freeze beside them. He had seen men run from storms and disappear 10 yards from the road. This was different. Rowan Hale had not beaten Ravenhook Divide by being stronger than the blizzard. No man was stronger than that. He had survived because he understood the thing that killed first. The wind. The storm searched all night for a way in. It never found one.